Imagine being chosen from thousands of young women across an empire, celebrated as the most beautiful, most graceful, most worthy of imperial favor. Now imagine discovering that this honor meant surrendering every shred of dignity, every trace of autonomy, every whisper of free will. For the concubines of the Qing Dynasty emperors, beauty was not a blessing, it was a curse disguised as golden chains. In the shadowed corridors of the Forbidden City, where silk rustled against marble floors and incense masked the scent of fear, thousands of women lived lives that oscillated between unimaginable luxury and profound humiliation. They inhabited palaces that were simultaneously prisons, adorned themselves in jewels that were also shackles, and performed rituals that elevated them to the status of goddesses while reducing them to the level of beasts. This is their story, a tale of power, submission, and the brutal realities behind the gilded facade of Imperial China's most sacred institution. The process of selecting concubines for the Qing emperors was a systematic hunt that swept across the empire like a net, catching the most beautiful young women from noble families and merchant houses alike. Every 3 years, the imperial court would issue a decree that sent tremors through households across China. It was time for the Zayunu selection, the choosing of beautiful girls. The criteria were exacting and merciless. Candidates had to be between 14 and 16 years old, unmarried, and from families of appropriate social standing. But age and status were merely the beginning. The real examination went far deeper, probing every aspect of a young woman's being with a thoroughness that would make modern beauty pageants seem casual by comparison. Physical perfection was the foundation upon which all other qualities were built. The imperial examiners, typically elderly court ladies with decades of experience in such matters, would scrutinize every inch of a candidate's body. Her skin had to be flawless, without blemish, scar, or mark. Her hair needed to be thick, lustrous, and naturally black. Her teeth must be perfectly white and evenly aligned. Even her fingernails were examined for shape, color, and cleanliness. But the physical examination was only the beginning. The young women were tested on their ability to walk gracefully, to speak with proper diction, to demonstrate knowledge of poetry and literature, and to perform various artistic skills including calligraphy, painting, and music. They were observed eating, sleeping, and interacting with others, their every gesture analyzed for signs of proper breeding and temperament. The psychological evaluation was perhaps the most crucial element. The examiners looked for signs of intelligence balanced with submissiveness, creativity tempered by obedience, and most importantly, the ability to endure hardship without complaint. They needed women who could think quickly enough to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, yet who would never dare to challenge the emperor's absolute authority. Those who passed these initial examinations were brought to the Forbidden City in groups, where they underwent even more rigorous testing. Here, under the direct supervision of the Empress Dowager and her most trusted advisors, the final selections were made. The lucky few who were chosen would become imperial concubines, but they would soon discover that their trials had only just begun. The Forbidden City itself was designed to reinforce the absolute power of the emperor and the complete submission of everyone within its walls. For the concubines, this architectural psychology was particularly pronounced, as their living quarters were specifically arranged to emphasize their lowly status despite their proximity to ultimate power. The concubines' residences were arranged in a complex hierarchy that mirrored their ranks within the imperial harem. The empress lived in the palace of earthly tranquility, at the very heart of the inner court. The imperial noble consorts occupied palaces nearby, while the lower-ranking concubines lived in increasingly distant and modest quarters. The lowest-ranking concubines shared cramped rooms in buildings that, while still luxurious by common standards, were clearly designed to remind them of their place in the imperial order. But it was not just the location of their quarters that reinforced their submission. it was the very design of the buildings themselves. The doors to the concubines' chambers were deliberately constructed to be lower than standard, requiring anyone entering to bow their head as they passed through. The windows were placed high on the walls, making it impossible for the women to look out at the world beyond without great effort. The floors were polished to such a high shine that walking required careful, measured steps, a constant reminder to move with deliberate grace rather than natural spontaneity. The pathways connecting the concubines' quarters to the emperor's chambers were particularly symbolic. These routes were designed to be long and winding, requiring the women to travel great distances through multiple courtyards and corridors. But more importantly, these paths were deliberately constructed with a gradual downward slope as they approached the emperor's chambers, so that the concubines would literally be descending as they moved toward their ultimate destination. The most psychologically powerful architectural element was the series of gates and doors that marked the approach to the emperor's bedchamber. Each successive barrier was smaller than the last, and by the time a concubine reached the final door, she would be forced to enter on her hands and knees. This was not mere symbolism, it was a practical requirement built into the very structure of the building. When an emperor desired the company of a particular concubine, the process that followed was an elaborate ritual designed to emphasize both the honor being bestowed and the complete submission expected in return. This ceremony, refined over centuries of imperial tradition, transformed what might have been a simple summons into a complex performance of power and obedience. The ritual began with the presentation of wooden tablets to the emperor, each bearing the name of a different concubine. These tablets were arranged according to the women's ranks, with the highest-ranking concubines' names presented first. The emperor would review these tablets during his evening meal, considering his options while eunuchs stood silently nearby, ready to implement his decision. When the emperor selected a tablet by flipping it over, the chosen concubine's name would be announced throughout the women's quarters by a senior eunuch. This announcement was always made in a formal, ceremonial manner, with specific phrases that had been unchanged for generations. The chosen woman was expected to receive this news with appropriate humility, expressing gratitude for the honor while showing no sign of either eagerness or reluctance. The preparation ritual that followed was exhaustive and humiliating in its thoroughness. The chosen concubine was immediately taken to a special bathing chamber, where she was scrubbed clean by attendants using perfumed soaps and oils. Every inch of her body was examined by a court physician to ensure she was in perfect health and, crucially, not pregnant with another man's child. Her hair was washed, combed, and arranged in a specific style that indicated her status as one chosen for the emperor's bed. The clothing ritual was equally elaborate. The concubine was dressed in specially prepared silk garments that were both luxurious and symbolic. The colors, patterns, and accessories were all chosen according to strict protocols that had been established centuries earlier. Golden jewelry was placed on her arms and neck, but these ornaments were designed to be easily removed, a practical consideration for what was to come. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the preparation was the instruction period. Senior court ladies would spend hours coaching the chosen concubine on exactly how she was expected to behave, speak, and move during her encounter with the emperor. Every gesture was choreographed, every possible response was scripted, and any deviation from the prescribed behavior was strictly forbidden. The physical journey from the concubine's quarters to the emperor's bedchamber was designed to be a gradual stripping away of dignity, each step calculated to reinforce the vast gulf between the woman's humanity and the emperor's divine status. This journey was not merely a walk from one room to another, it was a ritual transformation that reduced a human being to an object of imperial pleasure. The journey began with the concubine being escorted by a procession of eunuchs and court ladies, walking in a formation that emphasized her isolation despite being surrounded by people. She was required to maintain a specific posture throughout this walk, head bowed, hands clasped, steps measured and deliberate. Any deviation from this prescribed manner of movement would result in the entire procession being halted and the concubine being corrected, often harshly. As the procession moved through the various courtyards and corridors of the Forbidden City, the concubine was required to perform specific acts of obeisance at designated points. At certain doorways, she would stop and bow deeply. At particular courtyards, she would kneel and touch her forehead to the ground. These interruptions served multiple purposes. They extended the duration of the journey, allowing the psychological pressure to build. They reinforced the emperor's supreme status, and they provided opportunities for the escort to observe and correct any signs of inappropriate behavior. The most psychologically devastating part of the journey came as the procession approached the emperor's private chambers. Here, the architectural design of the Forbidden City played its most cruel role. The final approach to the emperor's bedchamber was through a series of progressively smaller doorways, each one requiring the concubine to bow lower than the last. By the time she reached the final door, she was forced to crawl on her hands and knees. But this was not mere architectural coincidence, it was deliberate design. The emperor's chambers were constructed so that the only way to enter was by crawling, and once inside, the concubine was required to remain on her hands and knees until given explicit permission to rise. This physical position was not just symbolic. It was a practical demonstration of the complete power differential between the emperor and his concubine. The crawling was not a brief token gesture. The concubine was required to crawl the entire distance from the doorway to the emperor's bedside, no matter how far that might be. In some cases, this could be a distance of 20 or 30 feet, covered entirely on hands and knees across cold marble floors. The emperor would often watch this approach in silence, sometimes requiring the concubine to crawl in circles or to specific locations within the room before finally allowing her to approach the bed. The crawling ritual was far more than a simple display of submission. It was a sophisticated psychological tool designed to reinforce the emperor's absolute power while simultaneously breaking down the concubine's sense of individual identity. The architects of this system understood that true control required not just physical compliance, but psychological surrender. The act of crawling forced the concubine to adopt the posture of an animal, temporarily stripping away her human dignity and reducing her to a state of primitive vulnerability. This physical degradation was carefully calculated to trigger specific psychological responses. The discomfort of the marble floor against her knees, the strain in her back and shoulders, the awkwardness of moving on all fours. All of these physical sensations combined to create a state of acute awareness of her powerlessness. But the psychological impact went deeper than mere physical discomfort. The crawling ritual forced the concubine to approach the emperor from below, literally and figuratively. This upward gaze from a position of absolute submission was designed to reinforce the emperor's godlike status. He would often remain seated or standing while she crawled toward him, creating a visual hierarchy that spoke more powerfully than any words. The unpredictability of the emperor's behavior during these encounters was another crucial element of psychological control. Sometimes he would allow a concubine to rise immediately upon reaching his bedside. Other times he would require her to remain on her hands and knees for extended periods while he ignored her completely. Some emperors would engage in conversation with their advisors or eunuchs while the concubine remained in her degraded position, treating her as if she were merely a piece of furniture. This unpredictability served multiple purposes. It prevented the concubines from becoming accustomed to any particular routine, ensuring that each encounter felt fresh and uncertain. It reinforced the emperor's absolute authority to control every aspect of the interaction. And it created a state of learned helplessness, where the concubines eventually stopped trying to predict or influence the emperor's behavior and simply accepted whatever treatment they received. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the immediate encounter. The knowledge that any concubine could be summoned at any time, forced to crawl, and subjected to the emperor's whims created a constant state of anxiety throughout the women's quarters. This anxiety was deliberately cultivated by the court system, as it made the concubines more compliant and less likely to engage in plotting or rebellion. The crawling ritual was never a private affair between the emperor and his chosen concubine. Instead, it was performed in the presence of carefully selected witnesses whose role was to observe, record, and ultimately validate the emperor's supreme authority. These witnesses were not passive observers. They were active participants in a complex system of power that required constant reinforcement through public demonstration. The primary witnesses were the eunuchs who served as the emperor's personal attendants. These men, who had been castrated specifically to serve in the imperial court, occupied a unique position in the hierarchy of the Forbidden City. They were trusted with intimate access to the emperor and his concubines precisely because their physical condition made them no threat to the imperial bloodline. But their role during the crawling ritual went far beyond simple attendance. The eunuchs were responsible for ensuring that the ritual was performed correctly, with every gesture and movement conforming to the established protocols. They would stand at strategic positions around the emperor's chamber, watching the concubines approach with trained eyes that could detect the slightest deviation from proper form. If a concubine's crawling was too slow, too fast, or otherwise incorrect, the eunuchs would immediately intervene to correct her behavior. But the eunuchs' most important function was as record keepers. They maintained detailed written accounts of each encounter, noting not only which concubine was summoned and when, but also how she performed during the crawling ritual. These records were considered official court documents and were preserved in the imperial archives. A concubine who repeatedly failed to crawl with appropriate humility would find her ranking within the harem diminished, while one who performed the ritual with exceptional grace might find her status elevated. The other crucial witnesses were the senior court ladies who had risen to positions of authority within the women's quarters. These women, typically older concubines who had survived decades of court life, served as both mentors and enforcers for the younger women. They would often be present during the crawling ritual, observing how their pupils performed under pressure and making mental notes about who might be suitable for advancement within the harem hierarchy. The presence of these witnesses transformed the crawling ritual from a private humiliation into a public performance. The concubine was not just submitting to the emperor, she was demonstrating her submission to the entire court system. This public nature of the ritual served multiple purposes. It reinforced the emperor's authority in the eyes of his servants. It provided a learning experience for other concubines who might be summoned in the future, and it created a permanent record of the concubine's obedience that could be referenced later. The psychological and physical effects of the crawling ritual did not end when the concubine was finally allowed to rise and approach the emperor's bed. Instead, the aftermath of this submission became a crucial part of the ongoing system of control that governed life within the imperial harem. The emperor's behavior after the crawling ritual was carefully calculated to reinforce the power dynamic that had been established. Sometimes the emperor would acknowledge the concubine's submission with a gesture of apparent kindness, perhaps offering her a cup of tea or allowing her to sit on a cushion beside the bed. These moments of seeming tenderness were not genuine compassion, but rather sophisticated psychological manipulation. By alternating between degradation and apparent kindness, the emperor created a complex emotional dependency that made the concubines grateful for any small mercy. The physical aftereffects of crawling across marble floors were significant and deliberately ignored by the court system. Concubines would often develop permanent calluses on their knees and hands from repeated crawling rituals. Some suffered from chronic back pain due to the unnatural posture required during these encounters. But these physical marks were seen not as injuries to be treated, but as badges of honor that demonstrated the concubine's dedication to serving the emperor. The psychological aftermath was even more profound. Many concubines reported feeling a sense of disconnection from their own bodies after being required to crawl. The ritual forced them to inhabit their physical forms in a way that was both intensely aware and completely powerless, creating a dissociation that could last for days or weeks after each encounter. The other concubines' reactions to a woman's return from the emperor's chambers were carefully orchestrated by the court system. Those who had been summoned were expected to display appropriate humility about their experience, neither boasting about the honor nor complaining about the treatment they had received. The women who had not been chosen were expected to show neither jealousy nor relief, but rather a careful neutrality that acknowledged the system without challenging it. The emperor's servants would carefully observe these interactions, looking for signs of discontent or rebellion among the concubines. Any woman who showed inappropriate emotion, whether pride, shame, anger, or defiance, would be noted and potentially punished. This constant surveillance created an atmosphere of perpetual performance, where every gesture and expression had to be carefully controlled. Within the imperial harem, the crawling ritual was not applied equally to all concubines. Instead, it was part of a complex hierarchy that determined not only who would be required to crawl, but also how far they would need to crawl, how long they would be required to remain on their hands and knees, and what additional humiliations might be imposed upon them. The empress, as the emperor's primary wife, was theoretically exempt from the crawling ritual. However, even she was required to approach the emperor in a manner that demonstrated her submission to his authority. The empress would enter the emperor's chambers walking upright, but she was still required to bow deeply upon entering and to remain standing until given permission to sit or approach the bed. The imperial noble consorts, who held the highest rank among the concubines, were required to crawl but only for a short distance, perhaps 5 or 6 feet from the doorway to the emperor's bedside. Their crawling was also allowed to be more dignified, with slower, more graceful movements that maintained some semblance of elegance even in submission. The noble consorts and regular consorts faced increasingly severe requirements. They were required to crawl greater distances, often across the entire length of the emperor's chamber. Their crawling was expected to be faster and more obviously submissive, with their heads kept low and their movements demonstrating clear urgency to reach the emperor's side. The lowest-ranking concubines faced the most severe humiliations. They were required to crawl the greatest distances, sometimes being forced to circle the emperor's chamber multiple times before being allowed to approach the bed. They were also subject to additional requirements, such as being forced to kiss the floor at regular intervals during their crawling, or to recite specific phrases of submission as they moved. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of this hierarchy was its unpredictability. The emperor could choose to impose more severe requirements on any concubine at any time, regardless of her rank. A noble consort who had previously been required to crawl only a short distance might suddenly find herself subjected to the same humiliations as the lowest-ranking concubine. This unpredictability ensured that no woman could ever feel secure in her position or confident about what would be required of her. The hierarchy also extended to the consequences of failing to perform the crawling ritual correctly. Higher-ranking concubines who made mistakes might face relatively mild punishments, such as being required to repeat the ritual or being temporarily excluded from court functions. Lower-ranking concubines who failed to crawl properly could face severe punishment, including physical beatings, reduction in rank, or even exile from the Forbidden City. Despite the overwhelming power of the imperial system and the severe consequences for disobedience, not all concubines accepted their fate passively. Throughout the history of the Qing Dynasty, there were numerous instances of resistance to the crawling ritual and the broader system of imperial control. These acts of defiance, while rarely successful, provide crucial insight into the human spirit's capacity to resist even the most oppressive circumstances. The most common form of resistance was passive noncompliance. Some concubines would crawl more slowly than required, or would maintain eye contact with the emperor during the ritual when they were supposed to keep their gaze lowered. Others would deliberately make small errors in their movements, forcing the ritual to be stopped and restarted. These acts of subtle defiance were dangerous, as they could be easily detected by the watching eunuchs and court ladies, but they allowed the concubines to maintain some small sense of agency within an otherwise completely controlled environment. More dramatic acts of resistance were rare but not unknown. Some concubines refused outright to crawl, choosing to accept whatever punishment might follow rather than submit to what they saw as ultimate degradation. These women were typically removed from the emperor's presence immediately and faced severe consequences, including physical punishment, imprisonment, or even execution. But their acts of defiance served as powerful examples to other concubines, demonstrating that resistance was possible even within the most oppressive system. The most psychologically complex form of resistance was the deliberate cultivation of indifference. Some concubines would train themselves to disconnect emotionally from the crawling ritual, treating it as a meaningless physical action rather than a meaningful act of submission. They would crawl with perfect technical compliance while maintaining a mental and emotional distance from what they were doing. This form of resistance was particularly dangerous because it was nearly impossible to detect, but it allowed some women to preserve their sense of self-worth even while participating in their own degradation. The imperial system's response to resistance was swift and severe. The court developed sophisticated methods for detecting even the most subtle forms of defiance, and the punishments for resistance were designed to be so harsh that they would deter others from similar acts. Public beatings, forced labor, and social isolation were common punishments for minor infractions, while more serious acts of resistance could result in death. But perhaps the most effective tool for preventing resistance was the system of collective punishment. When one concubine was caught resisting, the punishments would often extend to her friends, relatives, and even random other concubines. This created a system of mutual surveillance and control, where the concubines themselves became enforcers of the emperor's will out of fear that others' resistance might result in their own punishment. The crawling ritual and the broader system of imperial control that it represented did not end with the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1911. Instead, the psychological patterns established by centuries of institutionalized submission continued to influence Chinese society long after the last emperor had been deposed. The legacy of this system can be seen in various aspects of Chinese culture, from family relationships to political structures, and understanding this legacy is crucial for comprehending the full impact of imperial concubinage. The most immediate legacy was the psychological trauma experienced by the women who had lived through the system. Many former concubines struggled to adapt to life outside the Forbidden City, having spent years or decades in an environment where their every action was controlled and monitored. The skills that had been necessary for survival in the imperial harem, absolute obedience, emotional suppression, and constant vigilance, were often maladaptive in the outside world. The cultural impact was equally profound. The crawling ritual and similar practices had normalized extreme displays of submission and hierarchy within Chinese society. The idea that authority figures deserved not just respect but complete physical and psychological submission became deeply embedded in cultural expectations. This cultural legacy influenced family relationships, where children were expected to show extreme deference to parents, and political relationships, where citizens were expected to demonstrate unquestioning loyalty to government officials. The architectural legacy of the system can still be seen in many Chinese buildings and spaces. The design principles that were used to create the Forbidden City's hierarchy of submission, low doorways, sloping floors, and carefully controlled sightlines were replicated in other official buildings throughout China. Even today, many government buildings and traditional homes incorporate design elements that were originally developed to reinforce power relationships within the imperial court. The psychological legacy is perhaps the most complex and enduring. The crawling ritual was designed to create specific psychological states: learned helplessness, emotional dependency, and internalized submission that served the emperor's interests. These psychological patterns, once established, proved remarkably persistent and could be activated by other authority figures and in other contexts. The result was a society where extreme submission to authority was not just accepted but actively cultivated. The gender-specific nature of the crawling ritual also had lasting implications for Chinese women's status and treatment. The spectacle of educated, intelligent women being reduced to crawling on their hands and knees reinforced broader cultural ideas about women's inherent inferiority and their appropriate role in society. These ideas persisted long after the imperial system ended, influencing everything from marriage practices to educational opportunities for women. The crawling ritual of the Qing Dynasty represents one of history's most sophisticated systems of psychological control, a carefully designed mechanism for transforming human beings into instruments of imperial power. Through the seemingly simple act of forcing concubines to crawl to the emperor's bed, the imperial court created a complex web of submission, surveillance, and control that extended far beyond the walls of the Forbidden City. The women who endured this system were not passive victims but complex individuals who found ways to survive, resist, and sometimes even thrive within impossible circumstances. Their stories remind us that even in the most oppressive systems, the human spirit retains the capacity for dignity, courage, and hope. The concubines who crawled across marble floors while maintaining their inner strength demonstrated a form of heroism that history has often overlooked. The legacy of this system extends far beyond its historical context. The psychological principles that govern the crawling ritual, the use of physical humiliation to create emotional dependency, the employment of unpredictable rewards and punishments to maintain control, and the cultivation of competition and surveillance among the oppressed, can be seen in various forms of abuse and control throughout history and across cultures. Understanding the crawling ritual and the system it represented is crucial for recognizing how power operates in human societies. The emperor's ability to reduce intelligent, capable women to crawling supplicants was not based on physical force alone, but on the creation of a comprehensive system that made resistance seem impossible and submission seem natural. This system's effectiveness lay not in its brutality, but in its sophistication, its ability to make the oppressed complicit in their own oppression. The story of the Qing Dynasty's concubines serves as both a historical record and a warning. It reminds us that the most dangerous forms of power are not those that rely on obvious violence, but those that create psychological dependency and normalize extreme submission. The women who were forced to crawl to the emperor's bed were not just victims of individual cruelty, but casualties of a system that elevated one person's power at the cost of thousands of others' humanity. In remembering their stories, we honor not just the concubines themselves, but all those who have suffered under systems designed to strip away their dignity and reduce them to objects of others' power. Their experiences remind us that the price of absolute power is always paid in human suffering, and that the true measure of any society lies not in the luxury of its palaces, but in the dignity afforded to its most vulnerable members. The golden cage of the Forbidden City may have been demolished, but the lessons of its inhabitants remain. In their forced submission, we find a mirror for our own times and a challenge to create societies where power serves humanity rather than consuming it. The concubines who crawled across marble floors left behind more than just the marks of their knees. They left behind a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a warning about the true cost of unchecked authority. Their story is not just about ancient China or imperial power. It is about the eternal struggle between those who would control and those who would be free, between systems that reduce human beings to objects and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be completely broken. In telling their story, we ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain, and that their legacy continues to inform our understanding of power, dignity, and the true meaning of human worth. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, Hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. See you in the next one.